In 1956, South Australia experienced the Great Flood, an event described as the greatest catastrophe in the state's history. It was the highest flooding in the region since European settlement, but nobody asserted it was caused by humans because it was a natural disaster. There hasn't been a worse flood in Adelaide since. If this event had occurred in 2022, we'd be bombarded by propaganda telling us that it was caused by carbon emissions from human endeavours. Headlines about the dangers of climate change and the urgent need for harsh emissions reductions would abound. Now, the corporate and political classes have bought into this narrative to avoid the imminent climate apocalypse, which the so-called experts have been predicting will occur in the next 10 years for the last 50 years. And to do that we must hastily transition to renewable energy, whatever the cost. Those apocalyptic claims come to us from the United Nations, and with the Climate Change Bill, Labor is pushing to reduce carbon emissions by 43% by 2030, which marries up perfectly with the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is, by the way, the same agenda that led to the Dutch government to declare soil, of all things, as a threat to the environment and push farmers off their land and out of their profession. At some point, Australians need to realise that the net zero agenda is not about saving the planet. It's about preventing us from being energy independent by bringing our fossil fuel and nuclear capabilities to a halt. And for those who are cynical, refer to what's happening in Europe at the moment. At what point do we start assuming that international bodies like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, which also pushes the net zero agenda, have our best interests at heart? So let's see politicians and corporate elites and celebrities who moan about the so-called climate crisis lead by example and cede their own international travel aboard private fuel-guzzling jets. Let's see them eating up a meal in favour of crickets. And let's not forget that Australia contributes roughly 1.08% of the world's carbon emissions, compared with China's 29.34% and the US's 13.77% and even Russia's 4.76%. If carbon emissions do cause climate change, then our emissions are actually negligible compared to those of other nations. And if we look back, of course, it's pertinent to realise that none of the climate alarmist predictions from a new ice age all the way through to the melting of the ice caps have come to pass. But rather than admit these obvious errors, the climate propagandists simply change the nature of the emergency and push the catastrophe back a few decades, because their predictions have been wrong for so many decades. And that does beg the question, why are people still listening to them? We need to consider this, especially seeing that as the net zero agenda places us in a more vulnerable position regarding China, which is the greatest manufacturer of renewables technology, meaning our transition to renewables will ensure that we become reliant on the Chinese Communist Party's exports for our electricity. And since the invasion of Ukraine, Europe is learning the hard way that relying on a hostile foreign power for energy resources is a disastrous idea. Far from becoming a renewables superpower, as Labor claims we will be, net zero will simply mean greater economic dependence on the Chinese Communist Party of all organisations for our energy, placing them in a considerable position of leverage over us and ensure that we go down the path of becoming a tributary state. Power bills will become 500 to 600 times the cost, energy shortages, businesses going under, and it's all on the watch of those who support this bill, and we won't let you forget. It's time for those in this place to reject this bill. It's time for those in this place to put Australia first.